Of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening. Our topic tonight is going to be King Tut, or the King Tut exhibit that has just recently concluded in Seattle, Washington, and has been touring the United States. In order to deal with this subject and to show some slides, it is our privilege to welcome to our program Miss Emily Teeter, who was born in Seattle, has graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in history, and is now a doctoral student in Egyptology at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. Miss Teeter is currently the project Egyptologist for the Seattle Art Museum's presentation of the exhibit known as Treasures of Tut. She has taught classes in the field that we're going to be dealing with. She formerly was involved in the planning of Egypt exhibits on behalf of the Oriental Institute, and as a research assistant and National Endowment for the Humanities sponsored lecturer during the Chicago presentation of the King Tut exhibit. Ms. Teeter is also the co-author of several books and catalogs dealing with the history and art of Egypt. Ms. Teeter, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Joining with me in questioning our guest this evening will be three members of the panel. First of all is Mary Lou Reed, holding a baccalaureate degree from Mills College in California, did her graduate work in religion at Columbia University in New York City. Welcome, Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
Also visiting with the panel this evening is Mr. Roger Burr, a member of the faculty of North Idaho College, teaching in the field of history. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you, Tony.
And our third visiting panel member, and has been with us many times before, is Mr. Richard Snyder, who is an anthropologist and teaches on the faculty at North Idaho College. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series this evening will come from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Emily, the panel has quite a number of questions for you, but before we get into those, let's look at the series of slides that are available and ask for your comments on these particular treasures from King Tut's tomb.
Now, just a forward, this certainly is not all of the objects you'll see, or you might have seen in Seattle. The exhibit travels with photographs such as these, black and whites, documenting the tomb as it was first discovered. In our exhibition, we had 55 objects such as these. Really a wide variety of both materials, as you can see, alabaster and wood, metal, a wide variety, which tell us quite a bit about ancient Egypt. We also have a variety of different types of objects, that is, those involved with daily life, like this child's chair, or ceremonial objects like an alabaster casket. Also, quite a few things dealing directly with the funerary beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. And as such, this tomb is really terribly important. It gives us an idea of what life was like in ancient Egypt, and more importantly, tells us something about the funerary beliefs and political atmosphere at the time. Beyond that, too, we can get a lot of evidence about the economic situation in Egypt by, for example, looking at the materials, gold, ebony, alabaster, and, of course, determining what area these goods are from, determining exactly the trade sphere of Egypt during this time. The corpus of materials is also very important, as they come from the only essentially intact tomb from ancient Egypt. Thus, these items are really just a sample of probably what all pharaohs in Egypt were buried with. But this is our only surviving example of a fairly intact tomb. The gold mask of King Tutankhamun, the only surviving example of a gold mask from this period. Objects such as earrings, which were intended to serve the deceased. All of these objects were placed in the tomb as provisioning and sustenance and entertainment for the dead king. Keep in mind, also, these objects are a little over 3,000 years old, dating from the middle of the 14th century. Tutankhamun died about 1325 BC. It also is a very important aspect from the art history that the period of Tutankhamun is a transitional period from the so-called Amarna period back to the very traditional staid canons of Egypt. And so this is really a cosmopolitan time in Egyptian history, which shows influence from other countries. We can see evidence of foreign craftsmen, foreign materials. It really documents Egypt during one of her mightiest periods. And so the treasures are really important not only for their art value, but for the evidence we can draw from them for all spheres of Egyptian life. Of course, you have to temper this, that this documents only the royalty. We know almost nothing about the common man in ancient Egypt. But this, of course, doesn't lessen the importance of the objects. The objects are all national treasures of Egypt. Normally, they are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. But this is a special exhibition of objects sent to America as a bicentennial tribute to America from the Egyptian government. It's traveling through 6 cities in the United States. It opened July 4th, 1976, and will close in 1979.
We'll continue the questioning with Lou Reed.
Let's go back to the very exciting events that surrounded the discovery of King Tut's tomb. Would you fill us in with some of the background and some of the circumstances around it?
The story of King Tut's tomb, I think, is responsible somewhat for the excitement it's generated, because the story of the discovery of the tomb is really rivals the best mystery story you'll ever read. The tomb was, of course, discovered by Howard Carter and the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, 2 Englishmen. Carter was a devoted archaeologist, one of the first to really systematically use photography, and so the discovery of the tomb is very well documented. Theirs was a very long, long search. They vowed to start looking for the tomb in 1907, but it wasn't until 1914 they had permission to start working in the Valley of the Kings. Until that time, the concession or digging rights were held by an American archaeologist named Teeter. So in 1914, when Davis gave up, they started digging in the valley and dug until 1922 without finding anything at all. In that year, Carter was told the excavation was going to be shut down. He did manage to persuade the excavation to go on for one last season, and that was indeed the season when the tomb was found. It was discovered in November of 1922. So romantically, it's hard to believe. It was on the very last scheduled day of the excavation when Howard Carter's men found the entrance to the one tomb that they'd been looking for. This is after 7 years of searching. The story is even better that if you look in journals, you'll notice there are occasional slighting remarks about Carter and Carnarvon prior to the discovery of the tomb, of course. Most people assumed that the Valley of the Kings, where the tomb was located, was archaeologically exhausted. But Carter and Carnarvon were going on some very subtle and interesting clues, which had been, ironically enough, supplied by the last excavation team in the valley. So Carter and Carnarvon really had the last laugh.
Why do you suppose that it hadn't been discovered earlier? That there were all these other tombs that had been pillaged, they were found, and they found to have been pillaged earlier. What kept this one so secret?
It's very difficult to say. We don't really know. One reason why it probably wasn't found by modern excavators is because the position of the tomb. It was located so very, very close to a later tomb, that of Ramses VI, who ruled about 200 years after Tut, that archaeologists thought there wouldn't be another tomb in that general area. Generally, tombs were not built that close. We don't know why the tomb wasn't robbed in earlier times. We assume perhaps the Egyptians themselves forgot about the location of the tomb. They wouldn't have built a tomb so close to it if they had. Perhaps this is due to a landslide over the mouth of the tomb. Maybe in one of the very rare torrential rainstorms, debris was carried on top of the tomb. We don't know, but it seems logical that within about 200 years, by the time of Ramses VI, Tut's tomb had been totally forgotten and hence remained intact down to 1922.
But they were looking specifically for the tomb of King Tut.
That's correct.
Why were they looking for that one specifically?
Well, the Valley of the Kings, the location of the tomb, was a spot for the royal burials during a certain defined period of Egyptian history. This is the period about 1550 to 1070 BC for Egyptian buffs. That's roughly the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. Now, all kings within that sequence had been accounted for, with the exception of Tutankhamun and that of his predecessor, 2 predecessors, who may not be buried in the Valley of the Kings anyway. So Carter and Carnarvon were looking for this one unaccounted for king who they knew must be in the valley. This was further pointed up by the very subtle clues which I referred to. A small cup was found in the valley with Tutankhamun's name on it, some gold foil with his name, and the remains of his funerary banquet were also found, although people did not realize what it was until Carter and Carnarvon examined it. And so finding these clues with Tutankhamun's name on it, they were further convinced that the tomb of Tut was in the valley, but was not yet discovered. Now, it's rather interesting. Theodore Davis, the American archaeologist who worked in the valley until 1914, in fact claimed he had found the tomb of Tutankhamun. There is a book published called The Tomb of Tutankhamun and Horemheb, which is not the tomb of Tutankhamun. So, of course, by the time Carter and Carnarvon started, most people thought they were nuts.
But their determination.
Very.
I have to pass you along.
Roger Burr.
How many items are there in total from the tomb?
You'll hear different counts. The Metropolitan lists 5,000 objects. This is from a tomb that's only 900 square feet, to give you an idea. Other people count 2,000, and this comes with the problem of recording, that many objects were fragmentary, and so one object was counted several times. There are at least 2,000 objects from within this tomb. We only have 55 traveling through the United States.
Yes, I meant to ask you about that. How, from all the thousands of objects available, how were these 55 chosen?
That's, I'll have to answer that on hearsay because, of course, I was not involved in that process. The negotiation and the selection was done by Dr. Christine Lillyquist of the Metropolitan. She is the curator of the Egyptian department there. She apparently, as I've heard from her, went through the collection and just started making a list of objects. Things first which have not traveled, other things which are very popular and have traveled and people would want to see again. But primarily she was doing the selection on trying to get a wide variety of different types of objects and a variety of objects which could be approached on many different levels. For example, objects which tell something about religion, objects which tell something about history and daily life. So the objects, the 55 objects, can be really combined and recombined in different ways to tell things about ancient Egypt. Incidentally, the 55 objects, 55 was chosen as a number to commemorate the 55 years since the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. Everything's symbolic in Egyptology.
Did the Cairo Museum have assist her in picking these items or make any suggestions as to which ones they thought were
All of these
representative?
selections were due to examination by the Egyptian conservators to judge if the objects were, in fact, in any shape to travel. The Egyptians were extremely cooperative, as they have been with most archaeological endeavors. And so nothing was really taken out of the selection just because there was some reason why it shouldn't travel. The only rejections were made on the state of the object, because you must remember these objects are very, very old, very fragile. In many cases, wood with a layer of gesso, which is a plaster adhesive, and then paint. Now, obviously, this sort of thing can't take a lot of abrasion, which normally they do in packing and unpacking. So those sort of things were taken out of the list of original objects.
Are you pleased with the selection that was finally made?
Very, very, very. It's very funny. I admire the selection. I think it's very well done. Once people start reading about Tutankhamun, invariably I get a question that, well, my favorite piece from the tomb was Anubis. Why wasn't Anubis brought? There are only so many things that can come. I think Dr. Lillyquist did a very fine job.
Richard Snyder.
May I call you Emily?
Oh, do.
Emily, suppose someone misses this exhibit in the United States. It closes in Seattle, I think the 15th of November, and then what, it goes someplace else?
It goes to New York. It'll open in New York middle of December.
Well, suppose they miss the whole schmear and they're in Cairo after all this returns. Can they see this same exhibit in Cairo?
They can certainly see the objects, but there is no comparison with the display. We've heard this numerous times from the Egyptian curators themselves who've come to see the show, that there is a tremendous virtue in having fewer objects to look at. When you're looking at 55 as opposed to thousands, you become totally dulled with too many objects. With 55, you can really see them. Also, in America, we have the resources and the time to really display them. The majority of the objects are in single cases with very good dramatic lighting. Everything is, of course, rather dramatic, as opposed to Cairo, where they don't have the space or the funding to really display these things dramatically. If you go to Cairo, you'll find these things in multiple cases, just crammed together in adequate labeling, just because the Tutankhamun treasures are just a tiny bit of the hundreds of thousand objects which the Egyptian Museum has to display. So you will see the objects, but certainly not to the same advantage.
The other thing is, I was also curious, I was sitting here listening to other questions. What about the Egyptians themselves? I mean, the people living right today, do they care as much about Tut and his tomb as Americans seem to care by the standards of all of the people that have shown up to the exhibit?
The impression that I get is that they think we're a little crazy. Americans have gone, much to my delight, of course, off the deep end a bit with Tutankhamun. The Egyptians are, of course, extremely proud of Tutankhamun and their ancient history. And so they think Americans are a little daft for being as crazy as they are over Tutankhamun. But of course, it just brings up more national pride.
And that leads me into a third thing, if I may. Why have Americans, I think you said, gone overboard a little? It's a fascinating exhibit, there's no doubt about that, and it's beautiful. But why, all of a sudden, out of all of the things that Americans can spend time and money on, why King Tut and 55 objects from his tomb?
Well, museum directors across the nation have been trying to find out why, so they can can it and just sprinkle it over whatever exhibition. This is a problem. I have no idea, and as far as I know, no one else has any conception of why the exhibit has been so popular. Now, there are a lot of different reasons. You can say, oh, it's the gold. Everyone loves gold. Or you can say it's the fascination which generally people have with mummies and pyramids in ancient Egypt. Or it's the craftsmanship. But I don't think any of these really answer the question. It's a combination. It's some critical combination which has really supplied a lot of joy to people in America to look at the objects. I really have no idea. In Seattle, we have, toward the end of the exhibition, started to work with the psychology department at the University of Washington, doing testing on people before and after they enter the exhibition, and trying to get some opinions of why people have come to the exhibition and why they're interested. The data isn't available yet. We're very curious to see if it indeed answers this question.
May I go on for just one more thing? I myself bought a King Tut tie.
Oh.
From the Metropolitan Museum of Art, by the way, not from a little stand downtown. What about all of these duplicates, or whatever you want to call them, that have been produced, everything from T-shirts to this tie I bought that is supposed to be a replica of some material or something that was found in the tomb, to all of it. How do you feel about that as someone who, I assume, holds these objects and what they mean maybe a little bit higher than the average person on the street? What do you think about duplicating the commercialism?
Well, to some extent, as they say, imitation is the great flattery. Within certain limits. I have seen some hideous things, which I think are absolutely disgraceful. Among them, a frisbee with Tutankhamun's face on it. Presumably, you can send Tutankhamun up to the sky to join the sun disk or something. I'm not sure what the symbolism is. Some objects I think are very well done, and I admire them. But with some other things, Tutankhamun spoons, bells, things of that sort, it's no worse than any other sort of kitsch. It doesn't offend me. I think people should remember that Tutankhamun was, of course, a person. He was a ruler of Egypt. It's very much like creating poor, trashy souvenirs that has John Kennedy's face on it, something of that sort. I've asked the Egyptian curator exactly about this, and he said it doesn't offend him. He said America's a free economy. There's nothing you can do about it anyway. We really have no control. The majority of the objects don't offend me.
Anyway, I'd like to ask a question concerning the life of the king. Many people may not be aware of the fact of when this period was, but from the literature you have given us, it's my understanding that he reigned from 1334 to 1325 BC and was only 18 years old when he died, so he was really a child king. I was especially interested in the theory of put forth that he may have died very suddenly because at his tomb apparently was not well prepared, or it was not for such a dignitary as his. What happened, or what theories do you have about his death? Was it very sudden, and was it really not prepared for him?
Regarding the tomb first, that's a little bit easier question. The tomb is definitely not a royal tomb. It is too small. It is not of the basic design which was followed during this reign, or during this period. The Egyptian tombs did follow a certain pattern. and Tutankhamun's does not conform to that. It's been presumed that the tomb which his successor, Pharaoh I, was buried in was actually Tutankhamun's, but we have no real proof for this. Now, as to the cause of death, we have no firm evidence, and far be it from me to have any new evidence, because I am just as stymied as the rest of Egyptologists about the cause of death. Just this year, there was a new examination of the mummy. The mummy was completely x-rayed and gone over by pathologists. And once again, they could conclusively say they don't know what the cause of death was. There's no sign of poison. There is a small wound behind the ear of the mummy, but it looks as though it might be a post-mortem injury. And this is very well documented from ancient Egypt. Embalmers treating the bodies perhaps a little bit rougher than they should. And so we really have no evidence. There are no records to indicate any sort of assassination. We have absolutely no evidence. In this sort of case, it's easier to say we don't know rather than theorize poisonings or whatever. It does appear that perhaps, however, maybe the whole family was not terribly strong. We're not too sure. Tutankhamun is rather frail, but not excessively frail. It does appear as if he died unexpectedly because of the tomb not being prepared. But aside from that, we really have no concrete evidence to go on.
Thank you. Lou Reed.
Well, I'm still back at the tomb. You and Duke were talking about the mystique around this whole Tut thing, and I'm sure that some of the mystery that sort of was generated from a legend of the revenge of King Tut must have been sort of latent behind the current interest in Tut. Would you tell us just a little bit about what happened to all those people who were involved in the excavation and perhaps mysteriously died? The curse of King Tutankhamun. Most people who talk about a curse on the tomb refer to an inscription in the tomb which says, "All ye who enter here, abandon hope, the gods will," whatever. There is no inscription of that type in the tomb, so there is no evidence from the ancient Egyptians of that curse. Now, there was a lot of fuel to fire this idea of a curse when in 1925, Lord Carnarvon did die. But most people forget to point out that Carnarvon went to Egypt initially as a result of his health. His doctor told him to go to Egypt for the drier climate. In fact, he had doctors in attendance throughout most of his stay in Egypt, so it's not too surprising that Carnarvon did succumb while in Egypt. People forget to point out that Howard Carter lived until 1939, dying at the ripe old age of, I believe, 60 or 61, which is respectable for that period. In fact, another Egyptologist in Chicago did some statistics and came up with the conclusion that working in the tomb actually extended your lifetime, that most of the men who worked on the tomb did die at a later age. Although it is well documented that several people died during the clearing of the tomb, keep in mind it took 10 years to clear the tomb. And certainly these were not young Egyptologists that were allowed to engage in this sort of excavation. Of course, it was the senior scholars who were allowed to come into the tomb and work on it. So these men died in their 60s and their 70s. There just really is no truth to the curse story. It's been assumed that the story was invented by a journalist. Oops, dump on the media. A journalist who was very irritated with Carter and Carnarvon for selling the exclusive publicity of rights to the London Times. He was denied entrance to the tomb, although he professed he was an Egyptologist as well as an archaeologist. And the story goes that then he went back to his rest house and wrote a very inflammatory story designed to discourage interest in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. And he just really was having to invent his own copy.
Exactly.
Right.
It was the beginning of paycheck journalism.
Well, this sort of leads into the question of why on earth did they put all those things in with King Tut anyway? What did the Egyptians believe? Why did they believe he was going to need those after he was already dead?
The one idea which is really central to Egyptian religion, which continues through the 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, is that after death, the deceased would continue to live again in a life very much like the life of the living, except it would be more pleasant. There wouldn't be hard work, and it would be very, very nice. But they believed that the deceased would have to be provisioned with things that he would need during his lifetime. Thus, the tombs really became enormous storehouses, which contained objects from daily life, symbolic objects which could just function as real objects in the afterlife, even food. In the tomb of Tutankhamun were discovered mummified ducks and bread, proper provisioning for a pharaoh. In fact, in this aspect of objects being put into the tombs, People forget that even tomb paintings were thought to function in this way. The reason Egyptian tombs are painted is that these two-dimensional objects could actually function in the afterlife as three-dimensional objects. All of these things meant to sustain and provision the deceased.
Did the pharaohs get to have more things than commoners for any particular reason, because they were identifying with the gods, that particular aspect? Or did all the commoners get to take a few things along too?
The idea of rebirth and thus provisioning of the deceased was common throughout the entire Egyptian society, as far as we can tell. Now, again, there's a problem. We don't have that many finds from the lower classes because there just hasn't been the impetus for archaeologists to go after burials, which they know will be comparatively poor. But all people in Egypt were in some way mummified and buried with provisions. Now, there is definitely a difference between a royal tomb and a noble's tomb or a commoner's tomb, particularly in the religious prerogatives they could assume. All people did become associated with the god Osiris, who is the god of the deceased. But, for example, tomb paintings in royal tombs are religious in nature, different funerary texts, while usually in noble and common tombs you see strictly scenes of daily life. That it wasn't until a much later period that even those royal prerogatives were put into noble and common tombs.
Roger Burr.
One of my students was asking if it was possible to duplicate the mummification process today. Do we know exactly how they did it, and are we able to do the same thing?
Yes, it is possible to duplicate it. One of the curators at the Egyptian Museum is really the world authority on mummification. Very often in books you'll read that, well, we're not too sure, but this fellow is really quite convinced he knows how to do it. In fact, there is a rumor that he has mummified 2 people in the last 40 years. And apparently they are in very good shape. And so there is not that much mystery about mummification.
Oh, I see. Are there plans for any future exhibits, other artifacts from Egypt that will be traveling around the country?
There certainly are on the drawing boards. It'd be a little premature to start talking about schedules and objects, but there is an obvious interest in America for ancient Egyptian objects. Now, I think in the next few years you're going to see some major exhibitions of art. Now, what I think we're going to start seeing are exhibits of a more varied type. You start seeing things not from just one period, but perhaps a variety of sculpture from 2,000 years. I think we'll start seeing that quite soon. In fact, there is a major exhibition now touring, I believe it's in Brooklyn, of Nubian art, Nubia being the southern Egyptian area, and that has been received very well. So this does set a precedent for more Egyptian objects coming to America.
This leads me to a question that relates mainly to the Cairo Museum. Exactly in what way are they going to benefit from this? I know that there's millions of people have seen the exhibit already. They all pay entrance fees. How is the money divided up? Who receives what proportion?
By contract with the American museums, those entrance fees go to the museum. The entrance fees do not go to Egypt, because the Egyptians wanted to make sure that there was no admission fee to their exhibition. They wanted all Americans to be able to see this exhibition. So the entrance fee you pay is for the museum and not for the exhibition. The Egyptians do receive profits on certain souvenirs which are sold in conjunction with the show. These are all put out by the Metropolitan Museum. They comprise jewelry reproductions of statuary, fabrics, postcards, catalogs, books, posters. And all of those things will go to the Cairo Museum to help in the renovation.
I wondered, because the exhibit is so well displayed, in Egypt itself, the items are very poorly displayed. Is there any way that this knowledge can be passed on to the Egyptians?
It's not so much the knowledge. They certainly are very competent museologists. The problem is with the number of objects they have to deal with and the space. And of course, just their political situation. Trying to fight wars and build a museum just doesn't go together. So now, hopefully with the peace, they'll have more money to funnel into the museum. But we approach museology a little bit differently in America than Cairo. For example, American museums try to display everything very nicely and leave the bulk of their collections in the basement. Well, the Egyptians have so many very, very precious and important objects that they've totally given up. They put everything possible on display for study. And of course, that leads to just jammed conditions. Objects stacked up the walls, things turned wrong side to in corners, no labels. It's really just desperation. There is not enough area in the museum for the hundreds of thousands of objects, very important objects, which have to be displayed.
Do you think that there's any likelihood that the objects in Cairo will be eventually destroyed or will decay because they're improperly kept?
No, I don't think it'll go that far. Their curators are very competent. They're very quick to spot things. There is a problem with the storage in the museum, certainly. The basement tends to flood, and this could be a serious problem. And so this is really one of the highest priorities, is to arrange better storage for the objects. But no, the Egyptians are far more aware of their heritage and of their objects and general museum practices to allow something like that to happen.
Yes, it was in line with the question earlier about whether they really cared about their own antiquities as much as we do. And I think you're probably right, they do.
They certainly do.
As long as they have the knowledge and the wherewithal.
The problem is funding.
Yeah, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest this evening is Miss Emily Teeter, who is a representative of the museum from Seattle and the King Tut exhibit. We're very fortunate to have her this evening to discuss this very important topic. We shall continue the questioning now with our panel member, Richard Snyder.
Isn't the problem always funding? Or
Yes.
just about always?
Yes, throughout history.
I'm curious. King Tut, so far, at least in what we've discussed, seems to be a boy king that reigned for 9 years, and he's sitting there by himself in history. And I'd like to know, I'm liable to be way off on this, but it seems to me that he reigned during the 18th dynasty.
Correct.
And that the 18th dynasty began with the demise of some sort of Asiatic political influence in Egypt.
Correct.
And finally, what the heck is a dynasty?
A dynasty is a Greek invention. The Egyptians did not recognize dynasties. The Egyptians viewed their history as one continuous line, but a very crafty, actually an Egyptian priest during the Greek period, a fellow named Manetho, took it upon himself to make a little bit more order out of Egyptian history. And so he started, in some cases arbitrarily, slashing up these kings into dynasties. It's not like Chinese history where a dynasty is composed of one single family. Rather, these dynastic breaks are, in some cases, totally arbitrary. Now, with your comments on Egyptian history, it's certainly correct. Tutankhamun stepped into a very interesting heritage, the period of the most contact with other countries, the period known as the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties in Egypt. This is, of course, before the time of Tutankhamun, were typified by the takeover of the northern section of the country by people from Palestine, known to the Egyptians as Hyksos, which means ruler of foreign lands. Now, the several generations before Tutankhamun, these Hyksos invaders had been thrown out of Egypt. And so the period of Tutankhamun was also dominated by a new political awareness of other countries. And in fact, just a plain and simple imperialism, the desire to go back to those other countries and garrison them and prevent this from happening again. It was a great blow to Egyptian pride to have foreign people occupying the northern part of their country. So Tutankhamun comes into a very interesting period of Egyptian history.
Sounds like things in the Middle East haven't really changed that
No.
much since King Tut's time.
I'm firmly convinced very few things change through time.
Secondly, this is completely divorced from the last question, but I was sitting here, I know in my own field of prehistoric archaeology, there's a tremendous market in faking. We have people in Mexico making figurines in the original molds. And this presents a problem in determining what's a fake and what isn't. Do you have any idea what the magnitude of faking of Egyptian artifacts of one kind or another is? And is it a big business in the United States?
It's a tremendous business. Not so much in America, although it certainly is done in America, but in Egypt itself. A lot of these things are made as souvenirs and then are later, as they pass hands, passed off as being authentic. But then there certainly are people who make fakes, who make things which are going to be sold on the market initially as authentic. It's a very serious problem. Major museums in America have quite a few what we call ringers in the basement, things which were bought at exorbitant prices and turn out to be tremendous embarrassments to the museum. In some cases, it's just very difficult to tell what's real and what is not. In many cases, there are very subtle clues, for example, inscriptions or holes. For example, scarabs. You can pretty easily spot fake scarabs by the boring of the hole through them. But in many cases, it's almost impossible to tell.
Do you have any rules of thumb that you might pass on to our viewing audience if they're offered for $2.95 genuine something or another from Egypt? What would one do if you come upon some precious object? Do you go see somebody? Can you call up a museum? What?
Well, let's see. The rule of thumb that I tell people is, first of all, if it has a pyramid on it, it's fake, or a camel, because camels are not Egyptian. So that rules that right out. Now, if you do come across something which you think might be authentic, generally, museums like the Seattle Art Museum, if you send copies of photographs of the objects, we will look at them for you and give you an opinion. But it's usually best to start looking in books of Egyptian art and start comparing your object to other objects and seeing if you can see any sort of similarity. It's a very difficult and very tricky process, especially because there is always the chance that the thing might be real, and first of all, a authority may have not seen an object like it before, which is a tremendous problem. Also that it's authentic, ancient, and the person who made it, perhaps in the 18th dynasty, was a little unconventional. So the museums do also have a lot of things in their basements which they know are real, but no one else will believe they're real. It's a great problem.
I'm like Lou Reed. I keep going back to the tomb and dealing with questions there. Among your materials that you have given us is a diagram of the tomb, and it has the annex, and it has the antechamber, and the burial chamber, and the treasury. Would you take a few minutes to explain for us what was found in each, and something about the outlay of the tomb itself?
Sure. The tomb consists of 4 chambers, which were reached by a long descending passageway, sealed off at either end with doors. Now, there's a problem that the 4 chambers were each entered by robbers in antiquity, and it's fairly obvious that things were probably carried back and forth between chambers. So if there was some discernible order of objects per chamber, it's pretty much lost. The 4 main chambers, the first one, which was reached by Carter, is called the antechamber. The second, which he discovered, is called the annex. Now, the annex was primarily used for storing wine vessels, hundreds and hundreds of wine vessels, and other objects. But again, we can't really form a good criteria for what was in each chamber. For example, the antechamber and the annex both shared things in common, such as ceremonial stools and thrones, boxes of bows and arrows, things of that sort. The chamber which is really, of course, quite distinct is the burial chamber of the tomb. This contained the body of King Tutankhamun, and this is the only example we have of an intact burial. The burial chamber was almost entirely filled with a series of 4 enormous wooden shrines covered with gold foil, each slightly smaller. When Carter opened the 4th, he found within that a large quartzite sarcophagus. Within that, he found a nested set of 3 coffins, the innermost being of solid gold. Within that, he found the mummy of King Tutankhamun. The last chamber of the tomb was called the treasury, and again, these names are rather arbitrary. The treasury was the spot where the canopic material was placed, canopic material being the equipment which preserved the embalmed viscera of the king. The body and the viscera were treated separately. But the treasury also contained a lot of things which are duplicated in other chambers. Now, this was a great disappointment because we know so little about royal burials that Egyptologists hoped we could make some sort of order. People have tried to assign, for example, an element like fire, water, whatever, to each of the chambers, or a ceremonial function, but I don't think it has been convincingly done. I think the problem is the robbers came and mixed things up too thoroughly, if indeed there was any order initially. We just don't know.
Thank you. Lou Reed.
Throughout Egyptian art and some of these artifacts that we have viewed, there are lots and lots of animals. Animals sometimes are romping, and sometimes they're very stately, and sometimes they look like pets. And obviously, the Egyptians felt very strongly about animals, and perhaps you can explain to us some of the symbolism that is associated with some of these individual animals. You know, why do we think of the tall cat with Egypt?
This is sort of a tough question. First of all, you're very right in pointing out the animals are shown on almost everything. The Egyptians were very keen observers of their environment. So I would challenge you to find any object in the exhibition or in the treasures that doesn't have either a plant or an animal on it. Now, there's a problem with the symbolism of the animals. In many cases, we're not too sure what they symbolize, if anything. We don't have a nice little artist's book from ancient Egypt that says, if you want to symbolize so-and-so, use a certain animal. There are certain animals which occur repeatedly. One of them is a lion. This is fairly standard for many cultures, that the king is equated with a lion. We know this, it's backed up through the literary evidence. We have comments which say the king roared like a lion, or the king leapt like a panther, something of that sort. So the lion or a feline, a mighty feline, is often associated with the king. In fact, in several of our objects within the exhibition, you'll see a lion with the king's name on it, equating the king with the powers of that animal. Now, after lions, really, we get into sort of shaky ground. We don't know that much about the other animals. It's very often thought that the ibex, the desert goat, is associated with the royal house. This has been suggested. I'm not sure how convincingly. But aside from that, we're sort of on shaky ground. One animal which people seem to associate incessantly with Egypt is the cat, because of all the numerous bronze cat statues. Now, the problem with that is actually that's a later tradition. That was popular in the late period of Egyptian history, around the 7th century, but primarily in the Greek and Roman time, when the cat was actually deified. During that period, much to the embarrassment of Egyptologists, you find catacombs full of cat mummies, next to the catacombs full of mouse mummies and grasshopper mummies, I'm afraid. But the cat was a later symbol of greatness, which is not native to the Egyptians themselves.
How about the association of certain powers of gods with individual animals?
Certainly that is known, that a god will be shown either as a human or sometimes a human with an animal head, or occasionally entirely in animal form. Now, this too is a great problem when we start talking about Egyptian religion. Very difficult system to sort out, and scholars of Egyptian religion and anthropologists really have not come to a conclusion about what exactly this is meaning, the combination of god and animal. If these gods originated as totemic type things, we don't know. In some cases, there's no association at all between the animal depicted and the powers of the god, much less with the gods generally. We can't tell exactly what their functions are. The Egyptians had a very fluid religion and assigned numerous powers to one god.
Well, there's a big difference between a lion and a scarab. And why is the scarab beetle the thing that you're really probably most apt to find a fake of?
The scarab, we do know quite a bit about that. The scarab in Egypt is often seen rolling a small ball of dung before it. This contains the food for its offspring. The Egyptians, however, believed it actually contained the offspring. Now, the Egyptians saw this act of rolling the young before it as an act of regeneration. This was always done also in the daylight hours, in the sun. So the Egyptians took that as a symbol of rebirth. They equated that also with the sun coming up, the scarab rolling the sun before it. So the scarab, at least as an animal, is very well attested symbolism. In fact, from the very earliest times, it became the hieroglyph, which means to come into being or to continue. So that one's very well attested.
Is it still worn as a fertility amulet?
I am not sure. I've seen a lot of them around Seattle. I'm not sure about in Egypt. It seems to be very popular these days.
Roger Burr.
Could you explain to us what the Amarna period is in Egyptian art, since King Tut seems to be the peak of it?
In Egypt, in the 18th dynasty, things have been going on fairly conventionally until the reign of the man who may possibly be Tutankhamun's father. This is the pharaoh Akhenaten. He came to the throne of Egypt in about 1350. He and his wife Nefertiti instituted a almost fanatical change in Egyptian religion. This is a turning away from the traditional polytheistic or henotheistic, more properly, system of religion, and going to more or less a monotheistic system in which the people were obliged to worship the sun disk, which was called the Aten being the sun itself. Well, this was more than just a religious change. It was also accompanied by a very drastic artistic change. very well embodied by Akhenaten's motto, which was living in truth. So this period, this political period, became accompanied by an artistic style called Amarna, after the new capital which Akhenaten established, a style typified by very soft curving lines. And more oddly than that, new compositions of informality. Never before in Egyptian art do you see, for example, the king and the queen sitting in a garden with their arms around each other. In the Tutankhamun objects, you often see the queen presenting a bouquet to her husband. An entirely new idea in Egyptian art. This is carried also into literature. During the Amarna period, we start seeing colloquial Egyptian being written, which is totally unlike what was being done before. So the Amarna period was the period directly before Tutankhamun, entirely new system of thought. Tutankhamun, of course, had that as his heritage. He was born at Amarna, at the heretic capital. But during his period, we start seeing a mixing of the old with the new. It wasn't until the second successor to Tutankhamun, Pharaoh Horemheb, that you really see a backlash against this Amarna period.
My other question relates to the study you're doing. You were studying at the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the leading American university in Egyptology at the
Of
moment?
course, I think so.
And are you trying to establish a program at the University of Washington?
I certainly am. I have taught classes through their continuing education department, but they do have a very, very good Near Eastern department there, which has a tradition of teaching Ugaritic, other studies akin to Egyptology, Babylonian, Akkadian, things of that sort. And I think they are becoming more interested in offering some sort of course in Egyptian. The history department is doing more with Egyptian history. And I think that's really one of the great virtues of the Tutankhamun exhibition, is that it's brought ancient Egypt back into the limelight for universities. It's as important as Greece and Rome, and it should have the same attention.
Do you teach hieroglyphics?
I teach Middle Egyptian, classical Egyptian, yes.
Mm-hmm. Have you found any relation between the ancient language and modern Egyptian Arabic?
There's
Do
very
they use any
little.
of the words?
Now, I do not speak Arabic, but this is a familiar question, so I know the answer. There's very little carryover at all, mainly in place names, things of that sort, which normally would be carried over. But they're entirely different language families. There are a few loan words, but very little. Incidentally, there are two words in English which come down from ancient Egyptian. That is the word for ebony, which was ibu, meaning elephant, and ivory, hebni. Oh, excuse me. Ebony is ibu, and ivory, you know.
Richard Snyder.
Thank you.
Oh, I want to congratulate you on the breadth and depth of your knowledge. I'm just sitting here tickled to death. I'd love to know what drew you into Egyptology. I was sort of surprised when I first met you. I figured, pith helmet and bush jacket and leggings, and dusty tombs and so forth. And
I dress that way on weekends.
What piqued your interest in?
I don't really know. I wish I had a wonderful story like some of my other Egyptologist friends who can claim that from the very earliest days they did nothing but sit indoors and copy drawings of Egyptian gods out of the dictionary. I can't claim that. I have really no idea. I was interested in ancient Egypt, mummies and pyramids, just like most other young kids are, and sort of put it away for a while, and then it just came back, and I became very interested, particularly in the languages, and started studying hieroglyphs, and from there just got sucked in. It's an interesting study. The culture can teach us a lot about modern man. And also, it's a fun culture to study. You get the impression it was a very carefree society. People were happy, as opposed to some other cultures where people were not happy. It was a very, very benevolent, very optimistic society.
Secondly, the world is a number of years down the road from the great Aswan Dam project. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us just briefly something about that project and what effects has that had on Egyptology and seeing some of the ruins of Egypt and so forth?
Well, after the last raising of the dam, it flooded most of southern Egypt, which was called Nubia. This was too bad because a lot of the New Kingdom monuments are in Nubia. A lot of things will, of course, just never be recovered. It was about this time that Egypt started sending out large exhibitions of Egyptian art. The Tutankhamun exhibition in Paris of 67, Tutankhamun exhibition in London in 72. These all were to provide proceeds for doing at least a very cursory and rapid survey of the areas that were going to be flooded. As you know, also, the very familiar project of Abu Simbel, the large temple of Ramses II, which was cut up and moved. Several temples were moved in that manner, which have not been publicized. The problem with the high dam in Egypt is you have to weigh one thing against another. Are you going to save the monuments, or are you going to feed your people? A very difficult decision. As a result of raising the high dam, before they did actually do the work, the Egyptians threw the country open entirely for archaeologists and scientists to come in and work. They did document quite a few things, but of course there are things lost which will just never be recovered. There were some problems which were not foreseen, which have now come to light as a result of the high dam. One is, of course, because the Nile no longer floods and spreads a layer of new, fresh earth over the old, now the Egyptians have to resort to fertilizers, which is a vicious cycle. Once you start, there's no stopping. But also because the land is no longer washed each year by water, the salt is slowly rising up to the top of the land. This is very serious for agriculture. And also from archaeological monuments, salt tends to rise out of the stone. It will leach out of the stone, will actually carry carvings and paint just off onto the floor. You find rock just falling apart because the salt rises to the forefront of the rock and then flakes off. This is a very serious problem. As a result, quite a few of the royal tombs have had to be closed because perspiration and moisture and heat from tourists further leaches the salt out of the rock. Now the problem is, to my knowledge at this point, there's no way of stopping this. They just have to close down the monuments until the day when they can figure out how to arrest the salting.
And if I may, one more thing. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but is it true there was incestuous behavior in the royal families of Egypt?
What a subjective question. Very briefly, there were brother-sister marriages in ancient Egypt, particularly in the New Kingdom. This is because the royal line was carried through the females. As such, to become a pharaoh, the male would have to marry his sister. Now, this is something that's very shocking for moderns, and we imagine the Egyptians all as terribly inbred. But when you start looking at the evidence, there is really very little effect of this in ancient Egypt. This is because a king would have numerous wives. Very often these wives were from entirely different parts of the globe. We had such an enormous, a geneticist who was discussing this was pointing out that in ancient Egypt there was such an incredibly large gene pool that it caused very little problem. Only in places, for example, in medieval Europe where you have one family continually inbreeding does this become a problem. But in ancient Egypt the gene pool was tremendous. And it caused no real apparent problems that we can point to.
Read.
Well, again, we hear people who have seen the exhibit talk with amazement about how could people who lived so long ago have done things that were so beautiful, and it really startled. And I think it really has given a lot of respect to the Egyptians. What kind of tools did they have to work with way back then? And could you talk a little bit about some of the materials that they worked with, and who was doing the craftsmanship?
This just happens to be one of my specialties.
Good.
The craftsmen were all employed. They were paid for their labors in kind. They were organized into guilds. Very well done and very specialized. For example, there'd be a gold-working guild. There'd be a bead-making guild. There'd be a finishing guild, glass-working guilds. And so this is one reason why, of course, Egyptian art is anonymous, because one object would get passed between each guild. I think it's very important when looking at ancient Egyptian art, in particular the treasures of Tutankhamun, to keep in mind the tools and the technology of the period. The Egyptians of this period were using primarily copper tools, although bronze had started to come in. But almost all of this work was done with copper. Now consider they were working alabaster, which is fairly hard, wood, hard stones like granite, ivory, things of that sort. It's absolutely tremendous when you consider the amount of work that went into doing these. Finishing of things like wood or stone was done with progressively finer and finer rocks being rubbed over the surface. Finally, they'd be finished off with hardwood or bone tools. So it's very important when you look at these objects to consider what went into making them. Of course, it wasn't the tools, really. It was the amount of time that went into making these things. In ancient days, there wasn't such a rush as modern men are in to make something. It didn't matter if a craftsman had to spend 6 weeks making one small lamp. Labor was very cheap in ancient Egypt.
Were there guild stamps? Or there some way of identifying?
No, there's no identification. We know about the guilds from slightly later employment records of the guilds. Some hilarious records talking about vacations and why you weren't at work, excuses, things of that sort. It's very well documented.
They were organized early.
They were organized. They went on strike. We have quite a few records of strikes, sit-down strikes against the kings when they weren't being paid.
Did they get paid? I mean,
They
did
sure
negotiate
got
the whole
paid.
thing?
The rations appeared.
Are there any artistic processes that have really been lost that we do not understand that were employed on any of these artifacts? I was thinking of the lost wax process. Is there anything comparable to that?
Not that I can think of. I don't think it's the processes so much because the Egyptian techniques really are quite simple. Again, the problem is labor intensive. It's the time. The question comes, would any modern person want to put the time into making something like that? I think there are no processes that can't be reproduced. It's the time element.
And where did they get the gold?
The gold was mined along the Red Sea. There were numerous large gold mines along that area in southern Egypt, which were mined either by the Egyptians or the Egyptians finally decided it was easier to go down and subjugate that area. They received a lot as tribute from the Nubians.
And
We have gold mining maps. In fact, there's no mystery as to where the gold came from.
And is the gold all mined out?
Yes, it was mined out by Roman times. The Romans went down. We had remains of enormous camps. The English went down during the colonial days and decided, but they found nothing but enormous tunnels and no gold. Too bad.
Roger Burr.
During the course of the exhibit, I noticed that there was music being played while people were walking through. Is that actually Egyptian music? And is it possible to know what Egyptian music sounded like?
No, it's not possible to know what ancient Egyptian music sounded like. To our knowledge, there is no system of notation. And much to our dismay, there are only, I believe, 2 examples of even trumpets that can still be played. So we have tomb paintings which show us the instruments and how they played them, but we have no real idea of the tonal quality. The music that was in the exhibition was composed and performed by Dr. Jihad Rassi, who was a visiting professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Washington. I believe he's in California now. And that is not a recreation of, or attempted a recreation of ancient Egyptian music, but that is Nubian folk music, modern music done in the ancient manner.
My last question is concerning King Tut himself. Did his successor, you said it was the Pharaoh Ai, say anything about him or give thanks to him for having changed the religion back to the old ways?
No, not to my knowledge. We have very
I'm sorry to interrupt. You have to have a short answer to that.
Okay.
We have run out of time. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much, Emily. It's been
Certainly.
an outstanding program and most informative.
My pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Emily Teeter, who has been discussing with us King Tut and the discovery of the tomb. I know you've enjoyed our program. May I invite you to be with us again next week on this same station at the same time when again we'll be discussing what we believe is an important issue of our time. Until then, this is your moderator, Tony Stewart, wishing you a most good week and a good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.